might add, during that period, very early period of NPAP, we had a lot of people who had very strong European backgrounds, who knew what analysis should be and what it shouldn't be. And there was a saying that Freud himself couldn't pass final case presentation. They were tough. But nevertheless, most of us stayed there because we loved our subject. And it changed. NPAP started to change and not become so dogmatic and rigid. And there was a whole group of different people that started to come in.
When you started you entered here as a candidate, right?
Yes.
Was it in that atmosphere of orthodoxy?
Yes. Orthodoxy was it. If you mention object relations, it was, you mentioned it on the side. Spotnitz, he got thrown out of the organization. There was some very brilliant, creative people, but they were ostracized in many respects. So they had their own particular following as well. But it started to change. And to me, that was refreshing. But it's still, there were groups that kept on breaking off from NPAP that were more orthodox, more Freudian, and NPAP kept somewhat of its eclectic atmosphere. And that to me was one of the wonders of being a student there. So things started to evolve. There was a sexual revolution that occurred. Nowhere when I started out would you find a couple break up and the woman starting a lesbian relationship. That never would have been reported when I first started out as a therapist. And then it changed. Things changed faster than I ever thought would change. It was like the culture was going so fast that today I can't keep up to my students who are using that goddamn computer, which I hate. But they know how to use that computer in the most creative ways. And it's like it's passing me by. I watch it, and my grandchildren try to teach me how to use the computer. They are experts at it. And it's changed. A lot of this has changed. And there are so many new developments that are happening to NPAP that people go to. And I'd like to make a kind of axiom. I think it's very hard to try new and different things in an institute. Get your union card and then go to different groups and get your training there. But there are so many fixed kinds of forces that make it very difficult for things to move and change. It can happen, but the curriculum moves very slowly, very slowly. So you see the most exciting things happening in brain research, in infant-child theory, things that boggle your mind. I finally understood why you work with depression differently from brain research. And that you gotta read to keep up to this, which is very, very fascinating to see all this stuff coming through. And we talked about the future. Well, I'd like to make a provocative statement that maybe is not so provocative. Analysis is of two people whose unconscious meet each other. That, as far as I'm concerned, is analysis, and it has nothing to do with role. It has nothing to do with using the couch. It has nothing to do with using the Kleenex. But it has to do with the meeting of minds and the excitement of that. And as a result, the other part that becomes even more provocative that I will throw out to you is this. There is a constructive self that develops over the course of time. But there is also something that I call the luminosity of being. And this luminosity that some analysts have is part of the curative process. And you may call it a soul. You know, I hate that word, so we'll use just this light luminosity that mirrors the lost luminosity in another. So that there is an interplay between the constructive self and the luminous being of consciousness. And that what hasn't happened yet is for NPAP to have courses on nonverbal communication, where you pick this up, where you pick up nonverbal light, where you pick up from the body all kinds of communications, and that there is a language of nonverbal work. And there is not one course in NPAP about nonverbal communication. At least I don't think so. And that, to me, is part of the future. Part of the future is learning how the brain waves, which are part of the energy, how they get transformed into psychic experiences, and how I can tell, and many of you I'm sure can tell, I know one of my groups who walks down the hallway by the way they walk or the way they open the door. I can tell, as a mother can tell, if something's wrong with their child without the child saying anything, because they're tuned in and have this nonverbal connection. Well, this nonverbal connection is what I would like to see someday taught at NPAP. But maybe it'll be taught after you graduate. That is always there. You were giggling, so you must have.
I was thinking two things. One is more, I was reflecting back on what you said about the two minds meeting. And I think you've always believed that.
Yes.
And I think in your countertransference groups and in your work, you've always been attuned to nonverbal and affective and understated aspects of experience, and always construed countertransference as co-constructed and constructed on both sides by the patient and the therapist. And I was remembering that when the relational movement started in psychology, with mostly by people from NYU postdoc and William Alanson White, my reaction to it is, this is old stuff. You guys think this is new?
Yeah.
You know, I was trained that way in the early 70s, and they were a bit offended by that, I have to say. They sort of think of me as kind of a fellow traveler, but not really a relationalist, because I couldn't get that excited about throwing over this old paradigm, because I was trained on a paradigm that was already ahead of them. That was one thing I was thinking. The other was more intellectual, that we're supposed to talk some about the future of psychoanalysis here, and one of the things that I'm sort of fascinated by is how much is what we think of as psychoanalysis going to be called psychoanalysis in the future, because everybody is discovering the things that we've talked about in our communities, and they're labeling them with all kinds of other names, and it's hard to keep reminding people that there's been a whole tradition of looking at these things. But one of the pieces of research that's been fascinating me recently that I bet you don't know about, because it's mostly been written up in German, is Rainer Krause's work in Germany, where he's videotaped therapist-patient dyads, and he videotaped therapists of different theoretical orientations. I think it was general humanistic, Rogerian, cognitive behavioral, and psychodynamic, with patients who had been treatment resistant, who had failed 2 previous treatments. And he was schooled in, I also was trained by Sylvan Tompkins, and you may know the work of Paul Ekman, who was his student on the face as the organ of emotional communication. And so Krause videotapes these therapies and sort of analyzes what's going on in the respective faces of both parties. And what he finds is that in those dyads in which both the therapist and the patient agree that there's been impressive progress, what characterized the videotape was what he calls abnormal affect in the therapist. And what he means is that normal affect involves matching. If you're talking at me like this, within a millisecond I'm talking at you like this. But therapists, good therapists, do something more like what Dion called containing. The patient comes in, let's say, angry, and the therapist, instead of showing counter-anger, shows curiosity about why they're angry. Or the patient comes in with shame, and the therapist shows anger that someone shamed them. So at a completely nonverbal level, the patient is experiencing, there's a different way to feel about this.
Now, I'll give you a little modification. The modification I'll give you is that you pick up these abnormal affects.
No, you have abnormal affect. The therapist is not
No,
hearing.
no, you pick it up for them too.
Oh, yeah, okay, but I don't know, is any affect abnormal? I don't think so.
Okay. And you contain it, but there is another process that goes on, and that is the transformative work of what you contain.
Exactly.
So that you mirror back love, not ookie love, but love in such a way that you're turning something that was dissociated, disparate,
Right.
and you're giving it something new.
Right.
And that is the creative process going on in treatment.
And you can see that in these videotapes. And when they asked the therapist how they accounted for their success in these successful treatments, they all answered, of course, in terms of the theory of their orientation. Nobody said, my facial affect didn't match the patient's, and we took it somewhere therapeutic together. But that's what the videotape showed.
My first control, a man whose name probably nobody remembers, his name was Ann Serma, was a classical analyst. And yet, he had that luminosity about him. And he, in a sense, had a twinkle in his eye and an encouragement, so that though he was through and through classical down to his toes, there was something that was light and freeing that gave me the right to follow that light inside of me. And is not the theory, but it is the person who, in a sense, holds the theory for you. So it was a remarkable experience, because I don't believe that to try some of these nonverbal interchanges, they go on whether you're classical or not. They go on between people all the time. What you're doing is trying to see and collect them and have some mentation about them and to do something about it. Now, I find myself lecturing at this point. So
I started it, I'm afraid, but you asked me what I was thinking.
How come I'm lecturing with you right now when you could lecture to me? After all, we are equals. What am I doing? What is happening here between us?
I don't think there's ever full equality between a former supervisor and supervisee. I don't think the transference is ever quite gone, and I think there's some way in which, for unconscious reasons, we fall back into old roles. Thank you. I don't know if you guys know, I dedicated my book on psychotherapy to Art because he was certainly the biggest influence on me of anyone. And although he called me a pioneer, he was reading Betty Josephs and doing these countertransference groups 20 years before the relational movement.
There was actually a person at NPAP who introduced me to it. A person named Ruth Coleman. Sitting in this room, I think there was at least one who was in her group. That was Alan. And she was a pioneer in combining Gestalt therapy and countertransference. And I remember her classes at NPAP. She would always have a big spread of food. That good enough. And the funny thing is, I hated her. I hated her with a passion, and she reminded me of my mother. And Jules hated her too.
For all the reasons.
I might add, by the way, it's a very funny thing about my background, is that I have 4 aunts and uncles who are analysts, who were analysts when I first started the field. And this was a big problem as to where I would go in terms of training. And it was very clear. Jules was the man because he had that kind of spunk to him. He was a former union analyst. And he was a disciple, or trained by Theodore Wright. So I had this funny kind of business in my background. My mother was an orphan. My father, too, was kind of an orphan. And the world was dangerous. You stay in the backyard and play with mud. And I was known as a dirty kid because I loved to play with mud. And the world out there was strange and frightening and difficult. And certainly I was carrying the projection of my mother. Well, I'm telling you this because I believe our personal history always gets involved in our theory and the way we work. And I work like I like to make things messy and then build it up. And I often work with people who say, I'm more confused than ever. And I say, good. Because I like to play with mishmash. And the more mishmash we got, the more we could build something different. I just told Nancy, that my daughter, the granddaughter, is now building mud huts, and she's a graduate of Cornell, and a pre-med student, you know, but she wanted to build huts. And so I've learned a lot about putting the two people in my family together, because my family did work with art. And father did artificial flowers. They became interior decorators. I stayed in the backyard playing in mud. And finally at the wedding, I don't know if my wife remembers, my uncle comes up and says, "I'm your Uncle Jules, do you remember me?" And I say, "Oh, so you're the dangerous one." And I got to know him. He became, in fact, my supervisor. Broke a couple of rules there, but and I could have gone to postgraduate where my other aunt went, but that seemed to be too much of a company place. And William Allen White was full of psychologists, and I hated psychologists. My job as psychologist was to get out of the program as fast as I could without them touching me. Because I found them really, whatever they were presenting, I did not like. It was strictly cognitive, behavioral, God knows what. In fact, your Rutgers is one of the few schools in the entire country, doctorate, that has dynamic therapy.
There used to be a lot more. That is one of the things that's happened.
So I remember that, and out of that division in my family became a new profession called art therapy. If you would have told me at age 40, I would have developed art therapy. In my analysis, I discovered sculpting. And I love to play with a blowtorch and burn things up. My mother had to watch me because I always used to like to play with gas range or fire alarms, things of this nature that were provocative and I loved fire. And I finally put together a new profession called art therapy, which gave so much to me as an analyst. In fact, we're talking about the future. Another provocative statement. I think everybody who goes to an institute should have some kind of, if not an art experience, some type of experience other than the formal psychoanalysis. Just to find out what nonverbal touching and feeling, how one feels to put a pick against a stone, to see what will happen when you break it, when you open it up. All this is what I found with students. They are frightened of using your aggression because they're frightened of breaking somebody to pieces. And then they can, because they're not in charge and they're not centered and grounded. That term I owe my wife. My wife, who we've done workshops together, and the whole aspect of learning about energy, that part may be a little bit anti-psychoanalytic, but I find it very psychoanalytic. And so I put the two together, and it has been a marvelous addition to have an aesthetic experience of the space in between, to feel the energy move, organize itself, dissolve, destroy itself, build up again. All of that happens, even though the words on top level can be relatively innocuous. To me, that is the most fascinating thing going. Again, I'm talking too much. Will you talk, please?
Oh, let's see, where do I want to go with what you're saying? It's just a pleasure for me to hear you articulate aspects of your whole worldview that sort of shine through in everything that you do. And I think we probably should talk some about NPAP as an organization here. And I wonder how much you appreciate that it's the kind of organization that welcomes somebody with your temperament, because there are many psychoanalytic organizations that would not have done so. Was it your uncle that made it clear that you knew this could be a home for you of some kind, even though you hated half the people?
You were being very modest, more than half. It did have something of an openness to it. And an ability, but the thing that I think gave me most permission to go my own way was the art part. The art part in me was the part that it gave me the right to know what was really authentic and what was bullshit. Not that I don't always know, but it was very useful. You know, sitting here is an old friend of mine from way back, Alan Rowland, and he works with cross-cultural groups. Well, I have found that working with people from different societies, if I tune into their nonverbal, not the verbal, I get them.
Yeah.
I get them in a way that I never thought I would, by listening to the rhythm of contact, by listening to when things fragmented, and knowing Alan, he will take issue with me, but that was very important for me, to work with people coming from different cultures. It gave me a kind of insight of how to use nonverbal work. But I'd like to throw out the discussion. Please, folks, what questions do you have to ask us? Go ahead.
Anybody see? Oh. While we have you trapped in this room together, I would be fascinated to know where you would like to see psychoanalysis go.
First, I guess I should say I'm a temperamental optimist and an intellectual pessimist. I know that psychoanalysis will survive in some form because we help people and they know it and they tell people, and it's about an effort to try to be true. And people are always going to be hungry for that, whether you call it O or whether you call it analyzing defenses or whatever. So I think what we know will survive. I'm not sure it will survive, A, within the healthcare system, or B, under the name psychoanalysis. I mean, there's a whole cottage industry now in the cognitive behavioral movement where they